Good morning, it's Pastor Trish, and it is Monday, Martin Luther King Day, January 17th, and we are looking ahead to our scripture reading for this coming week on January 23rd. And I also think I have to apologize, I forgot to do a Facebook post last week, but I'm back. So let's look at Luke. We are back in Luke. For those of you who were in church yesterday, we had a reading from the Gospel of John, but we're back in Luke, the fourth chapter, and I just want to get us acquainted to where we are at so that you know that. A couple of weeks ago, when we last heard from Luke, it was the baptism of Jesus. And of course, Luke begins, just to take us back a little bit farther, most of the Christmas story that we know and love comes from the Gospel of Luke. And so that was our concern all throughout Advent, really, and these first couple of chapters of Luke. Then, 2 weeks ago, we had the baptism of Jesus. And after that, Jesus is sent out into the desert and is tempted. We'll be coming back to revisit that particular scripture reading on Transfiguration Sunday. No, first Sunday of Lent. That's when it is. We do the temptation story every year. Sorry about that. And we do that on the first Sunday of Lent. So we'll come back to that. But in the meantime, that's what we've skipped over. And so Jesus has been out undergoing that temptation for 40 days and is now back and headed home. He went back home and is speaking in the synagogue to the hometown buddies. And the scripture reading, we actually divided into two parts. You'll hear the first part this Sunday, you'll hear what Jesus says, and then next Sunday, we'll continue right where we leave off. And we'll pick up what Jesus, or how the crowd reacts to him and what they say in response to his words. And so it's kind of a two-parter here, but we will just do part one this week. Luke chapter 4, beginning with verse 14 through verse 21. Then Jesus, filled with the power of the Spirit, returned to Galilee, and a report about him spread through all the surrounding country. He began to teach in their synagogues and was praised by everyone. When he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom, and he stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And he rolled up the scroll and gave it back to the attendant and sat down. The eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. And then he began to say to them, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." He goes on from there, and again, that will be next week's. But what you heard is the scripture passage he chose for those who were gathered in the synagogue that day. This was a fairly typical activity that would happen in the synagogues. People would come in, they would read scripture, and they will go on to discuss it. We think about it. I think most familiar to us would be Bible studies where we dwell for a period of time in Scripture. And so this is not an unusual activity. You heard that earlier in the Scripture reading as well, that this was his custom. A variety of people may speak, read Scripture. It wasn't just the work of one prophet, priest, rabbi. And so this was not an unusual activity. What's special or unique about this is that Jesus is in his hometown, of course. And so we'll hear what that means and where that takes us next week. For today, I invite you to just consider the passage that Jesus chose, which was a passage, as it said, from Isaiah. It's actually Isaiah chapter 6, I believe. And he indicates, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me to bring good news to the poor, proclaim release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free." This scripture reading, the scripture Jesus chose, and the reading itself in Luke really sets the stage for the rest of the ministry of Jesus particularly as it is written by the gospel writer Luke. This is setting the stage for everything that is to come, provides the framework for how Luke viewed the ministry of Jesus, how we view the ministry of Jesus through that same lens. Who did Jesus come for? What was the role that Jesus was going to play? What was his anticipated ministry going to look like? All of that is answered right there in those couple of verses. I invite you to think about with me for the coming week and the coming days what those verses actually mean and who are the poor that Jesus is going to bring the good news to, and who needs to be released, and who needs to be able to see again. And are these literal words so that it is people who are financially poor and physically blind or in prison, or are these also metaphorical words? And if so, how are you and I in that situation? How might we be poor, or how might we need our eyes opened? And so I think many scholars might say it's one or the other. I like to think about this as a both and, that both a literal and perhaps a figurative or metaphorical way of understanding who Jesus is coming to minister is important for us to consider. So that's what I'm going to wrestle with this coming week, and I invite you to do the same. And I look forward to visiting with you more. Have a great day.